Hello, I'm Ginnette Sutherland.
And I'm Charlotte Dancer. Welcome to Nature Connects, the podcast from Tamar Valley National Landscape, conserving and enhancing the natural beauty of our landscape on the Cornwall and Devon border. In this extended episode, we're celebrating the beauty of orchard blossom and the benefit of hedgerows as we approach the Tree Council's National Hedgerow Week from the 5th until the 11th of May, with today's special guests. This afternoon, we're heading to South Hooe, a privately owned farmland nature trail near Weir Quay on the Bere peninsula, where we're diving into the fascinating world of hedges with Rob Wolton, a hedge specialist and author. Join us as we uncover the secrets of these wildlife corridors, connecting habitats and landscapes, and learn how they contribute to wider ecosystem services and how you can better manage hedges in the future. We'll also highlight the Plymouth pear, one of our Tamar Valley special species, and enjoy a Nature Connects moment as we take our regular slot to pause, engage, and connect with the natural world. But first, join us as we meet Mary Martin and James Evans in their beautiful cherry orchard near St Dominick. They'll share the fascinating origins and history of these stunning orchards, exploring the diverse species, management practices, and the incredible benefits to both biodiversity and our well-being. So Mary and James, thank you so much for having us here this morning at your orchard. We're in between Harrow Barrow and St Dominick, and we are surrounded by an awful lot of beautiful cherry, pear and apple trees. Can you tell us a bit more about what we're looking at here today?
We've been establishing this orchard since about 1992, thereabouts, and we were very lucky to get this little bit of ground because we'd started collecting apple trees, particularly in about 1980, having made a restored local cider press, and that got us interested in the old-fashioned apples. But at the same time, Mary introduced me to the remains of the derelict cherry orchards, which were really almost extinct, and we thought it was more urgent to have a go at saving Tamar Valley cherries because they're so unique to this area. And as I say, we hadn't got much land until this field came up, and we originally planted one-year-old wild cherry seedlings as rootstocks, and we had to wait 3 years for them to grow big enough for me to graft them, and that's where we started really. And the tree's now 25 years, a bit more than 25 years old, and some of them, I put my hands around them, they must be about 6 foot around, and they were just the size of a pencil when I grafted them.
That's amazing. And how many trees do you have here on the site?
Well, total, I haven't counted recently, but we've got 200 varieties of apples, 30 varieties of cherries, and at least 10 varieties of pears, plus all sorts of other odd things like plums and nuts and things. The cherries are the really big trees. Some of them are now 8 metres, no more than that, 40 foot in old money.
So at the moment we are looking at the trees, and some of them, the pears, they're just starting to come into blossom. The cherries will come into blossom, you said earlier, probably in the next 2 weeks or so. When the actual cherries grow, how do you pick them? Because some of these are very tall trees.
Well, we have stainless steel step ladders, which are very stable because I'm not very good up heights, but when they do come into fruit, which is not every year, we have a very, very good heavy crop, which we share with the birds. So the birds take quite a lot, I'd say at least half, and they're allowed to have in the top branches, but we get friends and relations, and we have done a trial with the Tamar Valley Grow Local box scheme, and we couldn't provide enough. They were so popular. We were wondering if they were going to really enjoy them as much as we do. But they are a particularly beautiful flavour, very juicy black cherries with an almond flavour. And we were really thrilled when we got our first proper crop and we sent them off in little £5 punnets and they came back, have you got any more? Have you got any more? So we knew we were on the right track.
When market gardening was at its peak in the valley, there used to be the big, tall, 60-foot wooden
That's
ladders.
right,
Is that right?
yeah.
The cherry ladders. Do you remember those, Mary?
I
'Cause
vaguely do, yes. When I was a child, we were allowed into Boetherick Orchard to finish off picking at the very tops of the trees where they hadn't actually finished picking. And I do remember being very stained with lovely juice and going up the ladders and bringing back lovely £10 chip baskets. This was back in the 50s, 60s. And then after that, it all went bad. People weren't growing new ones and the old people were dying out and couldn't to make new trees, you know.
So what you have here then is something pretty special because it is a lot of the old heritage varieties that if you hadn't stepped in may well be lost.
Yes, we were complete novices when we started to collect and we didn't know how to graft, we didn't know anything, but we got a lot of advice from the old growers that were just still around, and James had to teach himself grafting, so we had a few failures to start with, didn't we?
Yeah.
Because when James climbed up these really ancient moribund trees, they were only putting on about an inch of growth, and often we made graft wood from budwood, which then failed. So then we had to take the chainsaw to these old trees and then make new shoots and then graft the new shoots onto brand new stock. So it was quite a saga, but we got there in the end.
Can I ask what changed in that time period from your younger days when it was a booming industry and then there seemed to be generational change? What happened?
I think it was cheap imports coming from abroad and
the old trees had got so big too that they were difficult to pick,
Yeah.
and they weren't being pruned anymore. I think the start of the rot was after the Second World War. There were so many fewer young men around to do the hard manual labour, and there were easier jobs available for people who wanted to work.
And also a lot of trees had to be grubbed out for the war effort too, and a lot of the Tamar Valley daffodils, that's why you see a lot on the hedges, you know, they had to grow grain in unsuitable places, and it was heartbreaking for a lot of the growers. And then the ladders started to rot and nobody was making new ladders, you know, the carpentry workshops were no longer, and it all had a knock-on effect, but I think mainly it was imports.
The fact that they weren't investing in planting new trees and maintaining the soil fertility, because as Mary says, the older growers were getting to retirement age and there were no younger ones coming on to take it on.
And also it's the taste for bigger, sweeter fruit. The old-fashioned black cherries of Tamar Valley cherries were small and beautiful flavour in our view, but everybody was after big showy fruit and all year round too, so it wasn't seasonal anymore. So
we're lucky now because when we do have a really good crop, and there might be 10 tons of cherries here, we pick what we can, and we bought an extra freezer recently because we've got a good crop. You can fill up 3 freezers, and they'll keep for years, and you can then make them into jam or ice cream or yogurt or whatever in the future.
yeah, our kitchen table is like a massacre because it's covered in juice, and we're pipping and taking the stones out by hand because they're so soft and luscious. You can't use a stone pipper, and then we bag them up, and they're absolutely delicious in cherry pies, like my grandmother used to make. But she used to keep the stones in, and then we'd have to count the stones, so it made you eat your cherry pie a lot slower.
Slowly.
But in the old days they used to bottle because they didn't have freezers, so they would be making syrup and putting the particularly bullion cherries, which was a bigger cherry, in bottles. So I do remember my grandmother doing that. That was a real treat to have that on a Sunday afternoon
With clotted cream.
with clotted cream, yeah.
Amazing.
It used to be that there were lots of jam factories, weren't there, around the Tamar
There
Valley as
were,
well?
yes,
It's one
and
of-
where I live there's a barn conversion, and all down the bottom of that piece of land they used to have raspberries, and they were in great big earthenware jars, and then the co-op would collect those and take them down to the jam factory down at Devonport. and there was a jam factory on the Tamar down at Hay Meadow, and they would be boiling up all the fruit in the Tamar Valley. And I don't know about cherries, but I know raspberries used to go in the big vat, and then they'd bring wood chips up to make it look like pips.
And strawberries, of course.
And plums, of course, because there were huge Victoria plum orchards before they got the silver leaf, and they were sent off for the war effort.
So to maintain this kind of area and to keep the trees as they need to be,
It's
what
a time-consuming hobby.
a lot of work. Yeah.
I'm lucky I'm retired.
So what's involved then, James, at this time of the year? What would you be doing?
Every time of year there's a programme I work to, and obviously now, where are we, beginning of April, I've just finished pruning, and that's pruning apples. The cherries get pruned at the end of July and into August. That's the best time to prune cherries because it gives the cuts time to heal, so you're less likely to get fungal infection. Also at that time of year you can pick out any infected branches. There's a disease called tafrina, which is a fungus that infects the dormant buds, and then in the spring those buds grow extra vigorously, and you get things called witches' brooms produced, which is easy to control, but you have to just cut out these branches when you see them. So that gets done at cherry pruning time in the middle or late summer.
You have the sward management, which is...
Yeah, well, the other main jobs are we maintain the sward with wildlife in mind, so we let a lot of the orchard go to tussocky grass every year. An area is left more or less to go wild, which is good for the harvest mice and the voles, which increases the owl population. And also we've introduced yellow rattle, so we get more wildflowers. So those areas are less grassy, more varied plant life. The sward management is quite time consuming. That with the tractor I just mow around the perimeter of the orchards to keep the bracken out, because otherwise the bracken would spread in, and the blackthorn and the brambles, and it would become just a complete jungle. It's good for us to have a few areas where we can walk around. The other thing that normally occupies quite a lot of my time in the winter is propagating. So cutting graft wood, we can't help ourselves, we still keep collecting things occasionally when we find them. So the graft wood is cut around Christmas time and kept dormant in a cool place until grafting. And I'm usually grafting cherries in the middle of February, plums about the same time, and then apples any time up to the end of March really. In fact, I found something which I think is unique a couple of days ago. So 1st of April I cut a piece of graft wood and grafted it onto one of the existing trees here. Because we've got so many varieties, we've never got enough room, so most of the trees are family trees, and some of them have 4 or 5 varieties on, which of course makes pruning interesting. I have to be very careful not to cut off the one branch with the last of a certain species on it.
It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?
We have to be very scrupulous about collecting data and putting labels on, having a paper
Plans,
plan,
yes,
and a digital plan,
plans,
because we hate having sending things out that are incorrect, and they may become incorrect with other people's input.
It has been a wonderful improvement since genetic fingerprinting has become available. All the varieties we have here have been genetically fingerprinted, and about 60% of them are unique, except where we've managed to pass them out to nurseries to propagate them and spread them around the West Country. And the important thing is these are nearly all varieties that are specifically for growing in our climate in the West Country, which I'd include Devon as well as Cornwall.
And have you seen that change over time, how the climate has changed and how you've adapted to it?
Yes, I've noticed, being a landscape painter and being out all the time painting, that the weather has really deteriorated. We've had a lot less sun, and the seasons, the springs are much longer and colder. Everything has changed tremendously over the last 40 years since I've been observing in the Tamar Valley. But we're trying to adapt, and the reason partly why we have all this collection is so that we can grow trees that are suitable to the changing climate, and we do have very wet, muggy conditions down here, and they continue, but it is getting wetter and cooler, I think, in a way, yeah. So, we keep a big biodiversity of varieties here so that they can be adapted to whatever the climate throws at the country, really, So it is quite interesting seeing how they may be used up country for a while.
Yeah. So I'm really interested to ask, sort of talking about the changing climate and landscape that you're seeing, and I guess interpreting through your paintings, that you talked about your sward management within the orchards. So the increase in diversity in the flora and fauna, is that something that you had seen in the past and seen it disappear and now it's coming back, or is it part of the landscape that actually had left before your time and you're bringing that back in? Where we spoke earlier about how the valleys become far more wooded, it was on this cycle of when it was woodland then has become agriculture and market gardening, and now you're seeing it become more wooded again.
Yes, it's a 100-year cycle, more or less. You could almost call it a rotation of crops. In the 1880s, they cleared a lot of oak woodland around here to grow strawberries, because that's where the money was. And when the railways came, they could get strawberries up to London or the Midlands very quickly. So the market, which had purely been local, then became national. And now we see areas like down around Wolton Quay, the side valley there, which was all cleared, is now going back to woodlands and pheasant shooting and what have you. So there's been a 100-year cycle, really. But I'm old enough to remember, in Cornwall, you could go out into a meadow and see 100 butterflies at one eyeful, whereas now you're lucky if you see 2 or 3 individual butterflies in your garden at the same time. And here in this orchard, middle of the summer, when we've got lots of grass and tussocky and weedy between the trees, you might see 50 meadow brown butterflies. So this little oasis is slowly reverting to what I remember when I was a child. And I can't help feeling when I look at the farming around that although it's a green and pleasant valley, if you go into any wheat field, barley field, corn field, you won't see any butterflies at all because there's nothing for them there. So it depends on individuals, and everyone has a small patch of garden here where they could grow some flowers or flowering trees or whatever. Those little bits of land could be oases and keep the wildlife alive, basically, life support.
I think we have seen a lot of diversification in farming, which is a really good thing, breaking up the big agribusiness that's on the top with the big maize fields, big wheat fields. It's all for animal husbandry, really. You get a lot of runoff and the topsoil is washed away down in the Tamar. You see a lot of the manure going on just before rainfall, and then it all washes off. It's very difficult for the farmers with the global change to anticipate what the weather's going to be doing. But when I started painting first 50 years ago down here, it was still quite a lot of market gardening and flower farming, strip agriculture, horticulture, a lot of wildlife, a lot of, like James says, butterflies, and but it was just on the tail end, really, and it's gradually disappeared. Just a few market gardeners now who are doing eucalyptus, pittosporum, some double whites and some daffodil growing. But the strawberry growing has disappeared. Cherry growing obviously disappeared. That's why we did what we did in the early days, really. But I have seen the meadows that I used to paint in the marshland. There'd be ragged robin and iris and all sorts of varieties of wildflowers. And now it's very coarse weeds because it's not been appropriately grazed and the animals haven't been let in at the right time. So it's big changes.
We discussed earlier the shift in baselines and just what people perceive as normal, and I guess it's going to take people like yourselves, that knowledge exchange and ensuring the knowledge that you have and others have to
I think we
sort
have
of
just passed a
reset.
baseline actually, because
Yeah.
now a lot of these things are at least being talked
Yeah.
about.
Yes.
I mean, we've been tearing our hair out for years, but now things that are various hobby horses, you do hear on television and some very good wildlife programs where you can see there is much more public awareness now of what's happened, and that obviously is a spur for us all to do something to reverse the trend that's now irrefutable. We've lost so much, or nearly lost so much. There is a chance now to actually get on and do something.
Yeah.
Far more awareness amongst the young ones. It's our generation that's responsible for the deterioration we feel, but the young ones, we feel so sorry, you know, but they're able to learn more about the environment and they're so keen, and there's so much opportunity to find out all sorts of things about nature now. We feel more hopeful.
I think
Especially
that
now
there
we've got
are
our bird app.
university degrees for all sorts of things that didn't exist
Would have
30,
loved this.
40 years ago.
So as we've been walking around, I've noticed a few normal bird boxes dotted around, but there's one big one up in one of the trees. What's that for?
When the orchard was very young, i.e. the trees were only about the height of me, there often were a pair of barn owls flying while I was mowing around the perimeter of the orchard, and they'd be following the mower because obviously I was disturbing the voles, and the barn owls would be after them. So when the trees got quite big, I thought I must put up a barn owl box. So I went online and got the drawings for a barn owl box and made it in my workshop, and it weighed so much I couldn't even lift it. Anyway, I rigged up ropes and pulleys and things and pulled it up into the top of one of the big cherry trees. And while I was fixing it in the cherry tree, one of the barn owls was hunting all around the base of the tree, and I thought, oh, that's good. Since then, not seen a barn owl at all here, and I think partly because now the trees have got quite big and are beginning to close in, touch each other in places. What was a field is now, which is ideal for barn owl, has now become a wood. So we actually have more visits from the tawny owl than the barn owl, and they don't get on well together. So anyway, as it happens, only yesterday a barn owl has reappeared, and he flew through the orchard right over my head into a neighbouring field where there happens to be tussocky grass. So there are barn owls around.
I can hear loads of different birds while we're just here. I presume your other bird boxes are well used.
Yeah, so we've put up a lot of the usual kind of blue tip boxes and what have you, and 20 or 30 at various times, and they get very well used. The only snag is that the squirrels and various other creatures tend to destroy the boxes trying to get at the blue tit's nest inside. We have also put up dormouse boxes, which of course we're not allowed to inspect, but we did have one of the dormouse experts have a look last autumn, and he found a nicely filled box of wood mice. But I know we had dormice here because I saw them 25 years ago, but they seem to have died out here, which is a shame. I think they are on the Cotehill estate, but I think what happens is you get isolated populations, they get inbred, and that seems to be the problem. So it seems we need more corridors for wildlife in order to, which is partly what we're doing here, because we've owned a little bit more land up the valley, and some relations of Mary's own another little bit, which is a garden and an orchard, and you're getting a corridor there, and so that things can move along. We're hoping we might get water voles up in one of our ponds because it's all linking together, and you've got the Tamar at the bottom here. So anything that comes up the Tamar, like beavers or whatever, they may find their way up our streams.
I think we're finding too, with growing our hedges up, that we're getting far more species of birds here in the orchard, and we have 20 species of birds any time in spring, and I set the app going in the morning, and it's really hopeful because we've got lots of finches and siskins, and we never had those before. The hedges growing up, we've now got more blackthorn and holly and hawthorn, and it's looking really hopeful. seeing a lot of bird life. No.
And you picked up a bittern this morning, didn't
Well,
you?
I'm not
One
sure how
assumes
that
it was
happened.
passing
It must have
through.
been passing through.
It would be amazing if it is, because aren't they supposed to be the noisiest?
It's very deep, isn't it?
Cool.
Yeah.
A male bittern.
I should mate, which gets you in the chest. I have heard one
Yes.
down in the Marasian or marshes, and it really is distinctive when it's in full cry. Gosh.
Yeah. Wow.
I just want to talk about the beauty of the blossom and the fact that years ago people used to come up by boat from Plymouth to look at all the blossom in the Tamar Valley, and also the cherries when they come into cherry. It was a celebration, wasn't it?
They used to call it Little Japan, the valley, and it was so well known that steamers used to come all the way up to Calstock when the tide was right. It was a real industry, but it is that beautiful seeing the cherry blossom when you see it's so white and so black, the branches, and I don't think you can beat it. It's better than ornamental cherry. I think it is superb. When you see say a bullion or a Burkham in full blossom, it is an amazing sight, especially on the great big old hoary trees. It's something unique, and they smell. It smells of sort of almond, and it's full of bees, and it is a sight and an experience. And I think people were really well acquainted with the beauty of the valley all those years ago. It'd be nice to turn the clock back.
Cotehill, they're having a festival of blossom.
They do. We took part in that, was it last year?
A couple of years ago, yes.
And how about the cherry festival as well, the cherry feast that's held at...
Oh, at Pentilly, yeah.
Yeah, it used to be at Pentilly and now it carries on...
It's a Mallion. Yeah, we were involved in that actually, and we took some of our cherries. It happened to be a good year, and we took our peninsula cherries. And again, people were flocking to us rather than to the commercial cherries that were available. So we know we're on the right track because people were tasting them saying, where can we get these? What else have you got? But it was a really good experience. I don't remember it, but it used to take part at Pentilly every year, and just shows how important it was for the whole community.
And have you got a favourite cherry variety?
Well, I really like the Burkham, I think, because it's so reliable, so flavoursome and juicy. But then Fice and Birch and Ice have got the refined taste. They're more subtle and very special. So it's very difficult to choose. They all have their different qualities.
The Burkham is the best tree, because
Yeah.
it not only does it have the most beautiful blossom, it has branches that you can put a ladder against.
And it's the best tree.
It has a very good structure.
It's a good climbing tree.
Yeah.
It's
And I
good
like
for
it.
climbing as well.
I like it for painting best because when you have the light through each clump, they're very clumping, so, and you get like halos when you're looking through the blossom, and it's such a difficult subject and such a challenging subject. I've been painting it all my life, still can't get to grips with it, but it's the most beautiful blossom, isn't it, James? It's so white.
It's entirely down to Mary's painting of the dying cherry trees that we got into trying to preserve them, really. I mean, although I was brought up only the other side of Callington, which is a few miles away, from the age of 6 months, I'd never heard of the Tamar Valley cherries until I met Mary in 1980.
So, as part of the podcast and my learning, and as a team, we're thinking about some research that has come from the University of Derby about nature connectedness. And I think it's been clear through our discussion that there's been a disconnect within a generation from nature. But just listening to you both talk, my heart fills with joy when you're saying about the halo of light around the cherry tree and the blossom, and just your sheer love for that simplistic beauty. And what we're trying to get across to our listeners is that we all need to reconnect and strengthen our relationship with nature. You haven't got to be an expert, whether you know that it's a cherry or you just see a tree and you see blossom and you see fruit, that it's taking that moment or two to just stop and connect and take it in and get joy and pleasure from that. So it's whether it's sight, sound, smell, touch, that by taking those few moments each day to just notice nature around you, that you're retraining how you think and feel about nature. And if you do that on a daily basis, then your whole approach to nature, oh, you can hear the woodpecker, just strengthens and then makes you want to act and care for nature. So can we ask, and I'd love to hear from both of you, if we were to say to you now, whether it's from our walk up to the orchard this morning, could you share?
I'm a fairly high stressed person, and at the age I'm at now, I'm having to consider my blood pressure and things like that. When I'm really relaxed and comfortable is when I'm out in the orchard, particularly pruning, which is surprising because most people, I get contacted by a lot of people, how do I prune these trees? And I say, well, just look at the tree and see how it's growing and do this, that and the other thing. But I find it no stress at all. I just love pruning. I just love being in the orchard, preferably when the sun's shining, preferably when the wind isn't blowing from the east as it has been for the last few weeks. We were talking about climate change. We never used to have an east wind here, very, very seldom, but 2 or 3 days in the year. Now we get weeks and weeks of east wind. I don't know why, but it's definitely changed. But yeah, I wouldn't call myself a tree hugger, but I'm very happy putting my arms around a tree which I grafted when it was the size of a pencil and is now 40 feet high, and I can climb up and admire the view from the top. So that I find is my way of directly connecting with nature. But having been brought up in the countryside in the 1950s, when you could go out and play in the countryside and your parents wouldn't worry about where you were, or as long as you hadn't fallen down a Cornish mine shaft, and we were told what we were not allowed to do. Well, we were brought up in the countryside and we played in the river and we were down in the long grass and we were completely immersed in nature. Unfortunately, times have changed, and if we want to get young people interested in helping nature, we've got to remake that connection, because nowadays with modern technology and the way lives are organised, kids don't have that automatic connection anymore. To the little things you notice, and it's also those things help you to time the year. Right, now we're seeing the pear blossoms just coming. Okay, it must be the beginning of April.
I think it puts you in touch with time and the seasons too, if you allow yourself time to notice things changing. You don't have to know exactly what's happening, but that you use your own observation. I mean, I'm very high stressed as well, believe it or not, and I have terrible insomnia, but my calm place is thinking of being in a cherry blossom orchard, painting the cherry blossom, getting to grips with what I do best, and then I feel completely myself, and I am my own self, really, and I'm not stressed. I'm stressed because it's difficult, but it's my peaceful place, I think, and I wish other people could find that as well, because it's a lifesaver, really. It just makes you feel like you're part of it all. It is nature. Nature is the only thing that matters, basically. It matters to everybody. You know. It's so essential
to life.
We're all part of it, aren't we?
Yeah.
Don't think we are, but we are.
I think for me, earlier on when we were looking at one of the trees with the grafts and calling it the mother tree, and this mother tree nurturing these grafts, and it's just amazing how, as humans, we've learned and developed these skills to be able to use nature to support us. But as you say, without nature,
everything falls apart.
Yeah,
doesn't it?
and it's Mother Nature. We're that graft, aren't we?
I think we have become what you might call deep green, in that we can see things that are not right at the minute, and we feel very concerned for the younger generations. But it's not the planet that we're so worried about. The planet will still be here in hundreds of millions of years' time. but it's what the human race is doing to the planet which is going to affect the human race in the future, because we've only been around for a few 100,000 years as primates, but the only way, one way of feeling more optimistic is that nature will sort itself out. As long as there's one butterfly species left, give it 100 million years, there will be hundreds of butterfly species. And Mary's looking at me like I'm being too depressed, being too depressing. But nature is always going to be trundling along, and it's important, terribly important, for the human race to get on now and help it so that it can recover. And it is amazing some of the recovery things we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. And species that have been down to a few hundred specimens are now back in the thousands because people have cared and made it their project for life to step in and take the necessary action. I know it's controversial, but we're seeing beavers back in Cornwall, and there hasn't been a beaver around for 300 or 400 years, and I've actually seen the odd beaver dam myself, and it's wonderful.
And look at how they're affecting the planet in a good way in just a couple of years. It's absolutely amazing, the recovery of wetlands and further downstream, helping all sorts of things, projects. It is amazing, the recovery, isn't it? We're full of hope, really. We're not really deep green. We're full of hope for the now.
We're optimistic, deep greens.
We're optimistic realists.
So finally, if our listeners have been inspired by all that you've done to help local varieties and create this beautiful orchard here today, to have a Tamar Valley variety of whatever fruit tree in a smallish garden, what advice would you give? What variety, and what would be the best chances of that tree growing and thriving?
It's a very, very difficult question to answer, because if it's a fruit tree, everybody's idea of a nice fruit is different, because everyone's taste is different. And we had quite an interesting experiment down at the Eden project about 10 years ago, where we took down samples of quite a lot of different local apple varieties. And we assumed that the children would really like the Coxie type apples, lots of. No, they were much more enthusiastic about cider apples.
Clogger Pippin, for instance.
Because it was challenging to they actually noticed the flavour, whereas most modern dessert apples are loaded with sugar. And most fruit in general, and they're actually promoted for their sweetness, because sweet is something that the human body craves. And it was quite interesting that the children were more interested in the ones that were a bit challenging. But it is impossible to say, because there's so many varieties and they all have different seasons, and they need to be eaten in the season when they're ripe. One of my favourite gripes is that you see in the supermarket Cox's Orange Pippin comes on the shelf about the end of September, which it's, to my palate, it's inedible then. It needs to be ripe, which in natural conditions probably takes another 6 or 8 weeks.
I suggest a breadfruit. That's my favourite apple.
Oh, yeah.
It is very unique and it's very Tamar Valley. We only found one apple tree. We've called it breadfruit. We think it's a breadfruit.
It's a good
It's
choice,
a beautiful, beautiful flavour. It's unique. It's very white flesh and very attractive to look at. It's a good
Again,
shape.
you have to
it's good
keep
size.
it for about 3 or 4 weeks from picking it, and then you get this lovely straight strawberry flavour. Yeah, it's quite a surprise.
And they used to make apple dumplings with it, with a thin buttery crust and blackcurrant jam in the core, and it's absolutely delicious with clotted cream. But that's my favourite.
Homemade cottage cream.
Yeah, homemade clotted cream, yeah. But we've taken these apple dumplings to apple shows and that, and they go down a treat. But I would go for that. As James said, everybody's taste.
I agree. That is not only an interesting eating experience, it's also historically a very interesting variety. With genetic fingerprinting, the same apple has come up in Hungary and in Northern Ireland, and one tree in the Tamar Valley. I mean,
So how did that happen? There must have been like seaboard connections. This is what I like, the connections with all these different exotic far off places because of the seaboard nature of Cornwall and Devon.
It's certainly travelled across Europe over the last couple of hundred years. We think that it's a lost variety which in France is called Calville Blanc d'Ete. It's a summer Calville, and it is a typical Calville apple, which they do develop this strawberry flavour. The first time we noticed it, we just happened to have gone for a hike, and we had a couple of these apples in our rucksacks. And when we stopped for our picnic, we ate these apples, and both of us said, "Strawberries!" And it was just, they happened to have been stored for 3 or 4 weeks, and they just got to that maturity.
Yeah. And I think children, when they grow something their own, they're gardeners for life.
But to be able to pick an apple, be able to identify it, or
something very primeval about picking an apple from a tree, I'm sure, and a lot of people miss out on that. If you get the chance to be in an orchard, you talk to people and they have a memory, a folk memory of it.
yes.
Whether they've actually had an orchard or not, or been in an orchard.
So all of this experience and knowledge and hard work that you've both done all your lives, but particularly here over the past 30 plus years, what's happening now to make sure that all of that you've gathered and cultivated and now know is being passed on to future generations to ensure our local varieties are still continuing?
This is something we began to think about a few years ago, because all the old chaps, the local market gardeners, they'd all died, and we suddenly realised that we were the old people who'd saved their memories and information about the varieties they used to grow and what have you. So when we thought we'd got enough information, we did write a little book about the apples, Cornish Pomona, and more recently we've written one specifically, Tamar Valley cherries, because that really is the sort of primary way of passing on the knowledge you've collected. But we do have orchard visits here from time to time by the garden societies and what have you.
Given a graftwood to various orchards or various nurseries, and then they've made mother trees and sent the trees out all over the Tamar Valley, and we come across them quite often, and they're quite mature. Down at Morwell Ham, for instance, was one of the first plantings that we did. They're really ancient, and what's left are fantastically big and flowering, so it's very gratifying. We do have more apple days now that we've got a little bit more time. We're not actually we want to spread it around and socialise a bit more. So we've done a lot of apple days in the past at Eden and Probus to start with, and down at Cotial, where we've got our mother orchard, which is really great, and we get a lot of feedback from that. So it's lovely to be more social than we used to, and have more to do with the public, which is great.
But both with the orchard here and a small rewilding project that we've set up, we can sit back a little bit more and let the trees and the wilding get on with itself without our intervention all the time. So that does free up more time to talk to people and hopefully encourage them to do similar projects.
Wow, it's just another haven of the Tamar Valley, and it is vital that it is here.
We have a very remarkable climate here, really, in that people are afraid of planting trees because they think it'll take too long for them to see the results. It's not true. The soil is so fertile, and we have this maritime influenced climate, and we don't often have long droughts, so things do grow remarkably quickly. On our little rewilding, we put in over 1,000 trees only in 2020, and they are now, it's becoming a wood.
Yes.
It is absolutely incredible. It makes you feel old when you see these things, but it's not that long.
It does make you feel hopeful, though. Planting trees, whatever age you are, it just, there's nothing like it, especially if they survive the first year.
All these projects need attention to start with, get them up, particularly if you've got to guard your little trees from the deer and what have you. But once they get to a certain size, then
Doesn't
you
take
can
long.
just relax, enjoy
Yes.
the development every year.
Yeah.
It's one of the nice things about taking photographs every now and then. You look back at your photographs and you can see, oh, really? Was it like that? Yeah, and it's not long ago.
You feel a great sense of achievement. That's what we keep hopeful. You keep
Yes.
hope. You keep hope
Yeah.
for the future, don't you, when you plant trees?
Well, I could spend all day here with you both listening to everything that you've done. So thank you so much for accommodating us both here in your shepherd's hut, sheltered from the wind. And thank you for your time.
It's been our pleasure as well.
Thank you.
And now it's time for our regular feature, where we find out more about one of our 17 Tamar Valley special species. As a reminder, these are the animals and plants that we identified in our nature recovery plan that need extra support. This episode, we find out more about one of Britain's rarest trees, the Plymouth pear, from Ginnette.
The Plymouth pear, named after its discovery location in the 1800s, is a native deciduous shrub that can grow 8 to 10 metres high. Its purplish twigs and pink-brown heartwood are distinctive features. In the winter, you can identify the Plymouth pear by its hairless twigs with alternate, oval, purple-brown buds. The leaves vary in shape from elliptical to rounded, with a wedge-shaped, rounded or heart-shaped base. The flowers, appearing in late April and early May, are pale cream to pink and have a unique smell. It prefers full sun and thrives at the edge of woodlands and in hedgerows with moist soil. Once ripe, the fruit becomes fleshier and is a favourite food source for local blackbirds. Due to changing climates and the removal of hedgerows, conservation efforts focus on preserving this unique genetic resource, which hybridises well with domestic pears and may have horticultural value in the future. Plymouth pear is protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Seeds from its fruit have been deposited at Kew's Millennium Seed Bank to ensure its preservation. The National Trust properties Buckland Abbey and Cotehill are also championing the comeback of the Plymouth pear. So we are now at South Hooe, having spent the morning in Cornwall at St Dominick in the beautiful cherry orchards. The sun continues to just peep through the clouds. We've been half expecting a band of rain to travel through, but nature is on our side currently and we remain dry. So we are looking forward to meeting with Rob Wolton and talk all things hedges and biodiversity. Good afternoon, Rob.
Hello.
Really lovely to be with you here at South Hooe. We will go and have a walk around the trail and have a look at these magnificent hedges. So it would be great, just as we start off, for our listeners to really get an idea of what we are seeing here today. As the sun is peeping through, we've got this lovely hedgerow bank either side of the road, and just, why hedges?
It's a glorious afternoon to be here, isn't it, Ginnette? And hedges all around us, these wonderful Devon and Cornish hedges, characterised by their big banks, so important culturally, such a vital part of our landscape, wonderful wildlife havens, and do all sorts of good things for us besides, around floods, prevention or water quality, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
Yes. See if we can walk and talk without too much interference. So this hedge here, I can see that we've got the stitchwort and there's violets. So I'm guessing this is a much older hedge that we're seeing with the mature trees.
Yes, almost certainly. Our hedges in Devon and Cornwall, most of them are medieval origin, so they're 600 years old perhaps. Some of them will be older than that, because the landscape was well hedged long before the Enclosure Acts that we hear so much about. So they were just 150, 250 years ago, but our hedges were here a long time before that and are really ancient. Many of them are much older than our parish churches, for example, and they provide a sense of continuity through the landscape that's so important.
So for anybody looking at this hedge, what are the indicators of it being an ancient or a much older hedge?
Well, I think the first thing to look at is actually what plants are growing in it. And clearly, if you've got mature trees, particularly veteran trees, big ancient things, then it's likely to be 100, 200 years old at least. But then you can also pick out plants that are in it, which are ancient woodland indicator plants. So these are things that spread very slowly under their own steam. And if we have those plants, things like dog mercury, which is very common in our hedges, or bluebells even, which often is very common as well, then that strongly suggests the hedgerow is ancient as well.
We can see there's a little bit of blackthorn peeping through. So with the management of a hedge like this, the sides are cut but the tops have been left.
That's right. I mean, we're standing in a lane at the moment, and if the sides weren't cut, then vehicles wouldn't be able to get up and down the lane very easily. So they have to be cut every year. But there's no need to cut the top every year, and they can be let to grow a little bit. But they do need to be cut sometimes, otherwise it's all going to turn into one long line of trees, and that isn't necessarily the best thing.
No. Okay, we'll wander on a bit further and see what we find. So we've just stopped here and I've spotted the arum.
Yes, the lords and ladies. Well, it's a beautiful plant. It isn't an ancient woodland indicator of species, so it doesn't indicate a great age to the hedge because, in fact, it spreads quite rapidly. I find it occasionally growing in my vegetable garden at home. But I find it really interesting because it's actually pollinated by a tiny little fly, a moth fly. These are very small, but the plant actually captures these flies while they pick up the pollen and then releases them so they go on to visit another plant and fertilise it. All part of the rich diversity of life that occurs in these hedges.
What is the importance to have a richer diversity?
Yes. Particularly if we're looking at the trees and the shrubs, then the more trees and shrubs you have, then the older the hedges. Very good work has been done around that, looking at old estate maps and things and linking that to numbers of different species of tree and shrub in a hedge. And there's a general rule of thumb which is developed by someone called Tom Hopper, based very much on evidence, which suggests for every species of woody tree or shrub you have in a 30 metre or 30 yard stretch of a hedge, then that's 100 years. And so if we walk down this hedge and look in 30 metres, and we might see 10 different species, and then that would indicate that the hedge has been 1,000 years old. Right. And that's quite possible.
Amazing. We'll have a count as we walk along. So flies, I understand, are an interest of yours.
Oh, they're certainly a very strong interest of mine, yes. And there's a lot of different flies that occur in hedges. Remarkably, there are about 7,000 species of fly in the country. And you might expect them, a hedge like the we're walking on at the moment, to have perhaps 800 species of fly in it. So there's a huge diversity. I find that really fascinating. But they are very important ecologically as well, as pollinators and as general recyclers of nutrients. If we didn't have flies, then we'd have an awful lot of waste in the countryside, and it wouldn't look like anything like it does at the moment.
It is so important, isn't it, that we're encouraging people to understand the part that all these creatures play within the web of life.
Absolutely. And because we're so large, we often overlook all these very small things that occur in hedges.
Yes.
We're by far the largest thing in the landscape, and if you discount horses and cattle and perhaps some red deer. And we just don't see much of the stuff that's there because we're physically too big to do so. But actually, if you stop and look carefully, and there's a wonderful Devon expression, to pouch, which sums that up, then you can see so much more. And if you put out specialist traps, then you can just catch this huge diversity of life that's there and see there's so much more than the plants that we can see easily, and perhaps the old rabbit or bird. There's this wealth of miniature creatures.
So I know that a few years ago you did a study on a hedge at your home.
That's right.
And the findings from that were just amazing. So I'd love it if you perhaps tell us a little bit about that research.
Well, it all started with being challenged by a friend when we were driving together in a car in Suffolk, and we were just talking about hedges, so we're both enthusiasts, about the number of different species that might occur in a single hedge, and we were wondering about that and realised we didn't know. And so my friend, he challenged me to go out and find out. So on our farm up in West Devon, I just selected a hedge, and on New Year's Day 2011 started to look for things. And I carried on looking for things for 2 years. And at the end of that 2 years, I had discovered, with a lot of help from experts, it has to be said, particularly in identification, I discovered no less than 2,070 species in this single hedge. And it's not an exceptional hedge. It's a typical Devon hedge, or a typical Cornish hedge. But it all, when I tell people that it's over 2,000 species in just what in this part of the world is a bog standard hedge, they're typically amazed by it, because nobody realises just how rich and diverse these habitats are.
That was transient species as well as species and plants. That is their home.
I think nearly all of them were actually benefiting from the hedge, so gaining resources from it. So they may not have been breeding in it or reproducing in it, but they were certainly getting pollen or nectar from it, or finding places to shelter from the wind or protection from predators. So the only time when I thought, there's something that's not benefiting from the hedge, was when I saw a large white butterfly fly across the field, perpendicular to the hedge, hit the hedge, and then rise up over it and continue to the other side. And clearly the hedge there just formed a slight obstruction to that butterfly's flight. But nearly everything else you could see in this hedge, however big or small, was actually benefiting from it, using it in some positive way.
So that corridor connecting from one habitat to another.
Yes, absolutely that. But also they're habitats in their own right, you see. If you look at a good Devon or Cornwall hedge, they're not just the lines of trees and shrubs,
No.
how important though that is. But you've got the bank as well, which may be earth-faced or turf-faced or stone-faced. And then, of course, very importantly, you've got the herbaceous margins, which may well have tusky grasses or flowers. And they're incredibly important for wildlife, as well as any ditch that might be there, and any mature trees, particularly those with veteran features like splits and cracks. And the sum of all that means that you support an awful lot of wildlife.
And it's that recognition, as you say, being a habitat in its own right, and then it's the margins and where the ecotone of that merging into another. Exactly. So a hedge is more than the sum of its parts in many ways. So we've come off of the road and we're now on a track. So the hedge we're looking at now has changed from the roadside banked hedge. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here.
So yes, this does look like a much newer hedge, doesn't it? Because it's got no bank. So it's been planted up more recently, almost certainly. And it's nearly all hawthorn as we look up and down the hedge, although there's some blackthorn there which is coming into flower. And we've got a few ash trees which don't look all that healthy because of ash dieback at the moment. And really excitingly though, the hedge has been laid in year past. When you cut part way through the stems and lay them near horizontal to the ground in the Devon or Cornwall style. And that's a vital process to rejuvenate hedges and keep them thick and bushy, because that's what we want most of our hedges to look like. It's thick and bushy at the base. And if you just let a hedge grow without laying it or coppicing it, then inevitably, because all the trees and shrubs are trying to turn into trees, then it'll start to get mature and you'll develop gaps at the base, the wind will whistle through, and it won't be as good as for wildlife. So that rejuvenation.
So with hedge laying, that cycle of care, so if we're talking and wanting to maximise the hedgerow habitat and the connectivity through the landscape, can you talk us through the management cycle to get the maximum benefits from the hedge, not only as a functioning structure but also as a habitat, as an ecosystem?
Yes, I'll just start by saying there's no such thing as the perfect hedge. People often ask me this, what's the ideal hedge? And other than the fact that I think most hedges on a farm should be bushy at the base, because that provides all the dense cover that breeding birds nest, require for nesting, and so many other species need. I wouldn't say there is an ideal hedge. What you ideally want is at the farm scale or the landscape scale, hedges to be all sorts of different conditions. So they can be short and bushy, or they can be taller and ready for laying perhaps, or they can be actually developed into line of trees. And if you get a mix of all those sorts across a farm or the local landscape, then you've probably got as much wildlife in them as you can have. But in order to get that, of course, you have to take these hedges through this cycle of management. And that means they have to be periodically laid or coppiced and then allowed to grow up. And often you'll want to trim them while they're growing up to get them thick and bushy. And also because you don't want to spend your life probably laying a hedge. It's a very time-consuming business, and there's an awful lot of hedges in our two counties. So you want to keep the hedge thick and bushy by trimming as long as you can, but inevitably after a while it's going to start to get gappy, and that's when you need to lay it and coppice it and start the whole cycle of hedge management and rejuvenation all over again.
And so you would be seeing that cycle over sort of a 15-20 year period?
Yes, that's about right. Yeah. So with your laying, you if you're not trimming at all, you probably need to lay a typical Devon or Cornwall hedge in a reasonably fertile, not too exposed position every 12 to 15 years. But you can let it go a bit further before you coppice it, which might be a 20-year cycle. But if you are trimming it occasionally with, say, a flail, then you should be able to get 40 years out of a good Devon hedge.
So the perception hedges now that their profile seems to have been raised in more recent times, and I guess the research that you've done and others, what have been the changes and why? So why maybe have we had a period of neglect and now the tables are turning and we're beginning to realise the importance of the hedge?
Yes, now there has been a big change and in attitude towards hedges, much higher profile than they did have, much more widely appreciated. I think that's a number of reasons. First of all, there was this very sort of utilitarian view of hedges in the past, which is what they were there for, was as stop-proof barriers. But now, in all truth, we've got wire fences, which do the job even better often. And that means we can free up our hedges for all sorts of other uses and really appreciate them from that point of view. So we've really talked quite a lot about wildlife, and they're real wildlife havens, but they're also increasingly recognised to be valuable as places to store carbon and sequester carbon. And they're also really important for water control, water pollution, so preventing pollutants from reaching watercourses. They, as well as that, they're really good for pollinators and help us, of course, to get the food we need to eat, and for quite a few other reasons as well. all those things together mean that hedges now are much more widely appreciated and valued and have this high profile.
In the past, the incentives have been to remove hedges to make fields bigger for productivity, and now we're seeing hedges going back in. In your opinion, with the margin, the ditch, the bank, do you feel that if new hedges are going in, I know you said there isn't a perfect hedge or a perfect situation, but if people are considering and thinking we want to put hedges back, how would you advise that to be done for the most successful and thriving habitat?
Well, first of all hedges are good hedges. Yes. So planting a new hedge across, say, a bright green field is a really good thing to do, regardless of how you do it. I mean, true, in Devon and Cornwall here in the West Country, ideally it should have a bank. I do realise that often adds considerably to the expense of creating your new hedge. So it's not absolutely essential. But you also make a really good point there that the more space you can give a hedge, the better. So you've got the very narrow line probably of trees and shrubs, but if you can make space for flower-rich margins and tusky margins beyond that, then you'll support so much wildlife. When you think about the winter, for example, where are all these insects and so forth, where are they all living? Because they're living at the base of the hedge and they're living in the margins because there's no shelter for them in the shrubs and trees.
There's the cultural and traditional elements to hedges as well, depending on what county you're in and regions, that the hedges are different.
That's right. We've got this long tradition of banked hedges, species-rich hedges in these two counties, and it's important we do what we can to keep that going. But we don't want to get too tied up in, as I say, because actually any hedge is a good hedge.
And it's gaining the benefits from that, isn't it? Don't get caught up in the necessarily what you think it should look like. It's about creating the habitat and for it to be fully functioning.
That's right. And we need to be clear when we are making a new hedge exactly what we want it for, because that will depend what species we plant within it and how we manage it in the future. A hedge that's planted for wildlife is going to have a wide variety of different trees and shrubs in it, particularly things that produce fruit and flower throughout the year almost, right away from the early spring when you get your pussy willow coming out, right away through to actually this time when we're speaking now in April, and there are still berries on the ivy.
Yes.
And so that wide selection of trees and shrubs. However, if you're planting a hedge mainly so that it can sequester carbon or so it can produce you a good firewood crop, then you want to plant mainly fast-growing species like your sycamores and your willows and your cherries perhaps. So a different balance.
So as we've walked along now, we can see that we've got an oak just about to come into leaf. So hedgerow trees and the role that they play as part of the hedge. Talk to us a little bit about that.
They add a lot to a hedge. Not only do they make the lands look even more attractive, but the research shows clearly that they actually boost the numbers of invertebrates particularly, hugely. We don't quite know why that is. They seem to serve as sort of beacons, lighthouses if you like, around which insects congregate. And where you get the insects, you're getting the birds and you're getting the bats as well. But research has also shown that certainly for moths, they really act very effectively as stepping stones. So when a moth is trying to move from one woodland to another across the landscape, then if it can follow hedges and there are hedgerow trees in that hedge, then it's much easier for it to do that. And so when people have carried out moth trapping, beside hedges, they've got hedgerow trees, they catch far more moths than besides just hedges without hedgerow trees. So they're extraordinarily important in that regard. And of course, when they get older and they develop cracks and splits and holes, there's a whole wealth of things that live in them, whether it's owls or kestrels or bats, lots of things there. And of course the deadwood invertebrates as well, all those rare beetles and flies that depend upon deadwood. So the older the tree is, the more gnarled and twisted and split and fragmented, the better it is for wildlife. What we really don't want in hedges from a wildlife point of view is beautiful trees that are straight trunks, which are the ones that are good for timber.
Yes.
Because they're not so good for wildlife.
No.
They can be harvested quite happily.
So potentially a controversial comment, but something that I'm interested to try and understand why is with the management that we're now seeing, where there's been support in managing hedges, rejuvenating hedges and having hedgerow trees, is the management but the use of tree shears. Because I've seen, again, we spoke this morning when we were at the cherry orchards about the shifting baseline of this is what we think things should look like. And as you're saying, straight trees. And I've just seen cases recently where tree shears have been used to take off those lower limbs, almost to try and straighten a tree that does not want to be straight.
Yes, it makes me cry almost to see an old tree with wonderful sweeping boughs that they've been chopped off just so you can perhaps get a tractor a little bit closer to the field edge. And I remember watching purple hair streaks, for example, beautiful little butterflies on those lower branches, and later finding the caterpillars there. Again, because they're sheltered and low, they're extraordinarily good places for wildlife. But having said that, tree shears definitely have their place, because so many of our hedges are now lines of trees. About a third of all our hedges in Devon and Cornwall have developed into lines of trees. And that's not sustainable in the future, because eventually they'll get so big they just blow over and they'll take the bank with them, and they'll be full of gaps and they'll cease to be a hedge. They're what we call a relict feature. And we're losing a lot of hedges like that. So hedges need to be managed. And I mentioned before that coppicing is a very good way of managing hedges. So you cut them right down to the ground, to the top of the bank, and then you let them re-sprout. Now, there's far too many hedges to do to just do it all by hand and chainsaw. The thing about tree shears is you can do several hundred metres of a hedge in a morning. And so they're a game changer in that regard. But the problem comes when too much is done too soon. So if you do a whole farm, 100 acres, and I've seen that happen, all in one go, then there's no habitat continuity, so then it is good. But if you do 100 metres here, 100 metres there, say 5% of the hedges on a farm every 1 year, then it's a good thing, because it's getting that cycle going again.
So it's again in that management cycle, whether you're hedge laying or whether you're coppicing, whether you're using tree shears, is actually creating that management plan over multiple years to ensure that you're keeping habitats intact whilst doing the management.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing about tree shears, of course, is if you've got an unsafe tree, say one that's got ash dieback, then you can safely deal with it. Or if it's got lines, telephone lines or electricity cables going through it, you can manage it safely and much more cheaply than you would be able to do otherwise.
Yes, because I've wondered the use of tree shears, of whether there is training with them or there should be training, because in some instances I've seen where it's not particularly perhaps been a clean cut. Does that matter? Is it important that it is clean, or do we look at it in that it's part of an ageing process by that damage, whether that then is creating habitat and space for invertebrates and other species?
Yes, there's definitely good ways and bad ways of using tree shear, and the Devon Hedge Group has just produced detailed guidance on that. But basically, most of our trees and shrubs are remarkably resilient to damage. And if you're an insect or fungus or something that likes dead wood, then you don't want a nice clean surface. No. You want them that's a bit rough and splintered and jagged. So one of the things we as humans tend to like is things to be neat and tidy. And that isn't what wildlife likes. Wildlife wants things to be scruffy. So the scruffier the better. And I find myself wanting things to be neat and tidy. It's something we need to somehow progress on from that and appreciate the brambles and the blackthorn suckers and the jagged edges and the torn bits of branch as all contributing to the value of a hedge for wildlife.
As we sit here with the sun on our backs, admiring the view over the Tamar Valley, it seems to be the perfect opportunity to have our regular slot to connect with nature. So if you can, take a moment or two to pause, engage and connect. So we've taken refuge in one of the bird hides. The hedge was giving us some shelter, but not quite enough. So we've talked about hedgerow trees and the part they play in the overall structure and habitat of the hedge. Other management practices for shaping hedges and, again, supporting that management. Talk us through a little bit more on other management practices.
Yes, sure. What I particularly like to talk about is about the flail, because nothing causes more anxiety in local communities than the flail, because it can look ghastly, can't it? You get a hedge that's cut, particularly if it's got 2 or 3 years growth on it, and you've got all these shattered edges, and it looks horrible. But then I have to think, it may look horrible to us, but is it actually horrible for wildlife? And often I think it isn't. And it's better for wildlife to cut only occasionally, even though you've got shattered ends, than it is to trim your hedge every year. Because if you trim your hedge every year and you trim it close, then you remove all the flower buds. And if you don't get any flowers, of course, you don't get any berries or nuts or anything. So it's more or less useless from a point of view of all those pollinators and all the birds that are depending on the berries in the winter. But if, on the other hand, you can cut it on a 2 or 3 year rotation, it may not look so nice, but at least you get some flowers and some berries, which is really good. And often you see a hedge in the winter that looks absolutely ghastly, but you come back by July and it's all greened up and it looks good. And people think, well, there's all sorts of fungi and infection getting into those shattered edges. Well, there's no real evidence suggests that's the case. And it does just seem that our native trees and shrubs are so resilient to this sort of damage. This is where I bring in elephants, because there is this theory, and I think it's a good one, that all our native trees and shrubs are adapted to being eaten by the straight-tusked elephant. Now, the straight-tusked elephant used to roam these parts in the last interglacial. It's a huge beast. It's twice the size of the African elephant. And you know how elephants feed, ripping and tearing. It's not a neat job. And that's what they must have done to so many of our native trees and shrubs, which perhaps explains why they recover from flail mowing so quickly. But having said all that, there are good ways and bad ways to flail. Certainly, cutting every year and cutting hard is not much good. You end up with a knuckle, and sooner or later the hedge becomes moribund, it becomes gappy. But there is a new game in town, and that is what's called incremental trimming, where you can still cut every year. And a lot of people want to do that because they do, it's understandable, want the hedge to look neat and tidy. But you raise the cutting height by just a few inches each time, 4 to 6 inches. And the research shows that that has considerable benefits in terms of the amounts of flowers and berries that are produced, also in terms of the hedge health. So it's another game changer, like the tree shears.
And again, it's giving the hedge that space to breathe, isn't it?
That's right, and you end up with a much better structure to your hedge. I mean, sooner or later it's going to get really big. You can't carry on doing that indefinitely. But then you can either rejuvenate it by laying or coppicing it, or you can come along and cut it back to your desired height with one machine or another.
So you often see flailed hedges as being quite boxy. Is there a preferred way of flailing?
I think the verdict is out on this at the moment. Often where people have said you should have A-shaped hedges that run to a point at the top, because you get more light into the base of the hedge, and that encourages all the good growth and also lots of flowering plants. But there's no real evidence to support that. Right. And the reason why we tend to have a lot of the square cut hedges is because of the banks. And they just tend to lend themselves to, when you're driving your tractor, to having a square profile. Yes. Personally, I think the nicest hedges are when they're just let to grow up a little bit higher, and then the edges are chamfered. Yes. That looks really good to me, and I suspect, I have no evidence of this, is good for wildlife as well. There is another way of cutting hedges as well, and that's been developed by a farmer within the Tamar Valley, and that is where you actually let your hedge develop a central line of trees. So rather than cutting it right the way across flat at the top, you just allow this central band to grow up. And that produces more structure for your hedge, captures more carbon, is good for wildlife. And if it gets too big and starts to shade out the hedge below, then you can come along with your tree shears and cut it down again.
Yes. Because I've also seen where they've created turrets of hedge along a stretch.
Well, I think variety is good, and there's nothing that's right in all this. There's some things that are wrong, but there's no perfect way of doing things, and all that variety and changes in structure can only be good.
That's it, and provides opportunity, and again it links back to previous conversations. It's trying out these different techniques, different ways of doing things, and learn from it. It is, I guess, being engaged and monitoring and observing the changes and what is there, what isn't, why isn't it, why is it, and asking those questions, isn't it?
That's exactly right. Every hedge is different. Yeah. And every hedge needs to be managed slightly differently.
Yes. So we've had a lovely walk around the farm trail, and to finish off our conversation, Rob, I would like to ask you about nature connectedness, which has been one of the themes that is threaded through each of our episodes, and we're just asking our guests to share with us those nature connectedness moments that are important to you. Often they're quite personal to us, but just trying to encourage our listeners to take a moment or two just to stop and engage with nature around them. It's the small things that give us hope and joy and pleasure, and in turn help us to reconnect with nature so that we can all do our bit to support its recovery. So would you share with us from our time together this afternoon just some of the moments that have captured you?
By all means. And yes, it's been a beautiful walk, and we've seen some lovely hedges. And I think the things that I loved in particular was, we're walking down a lane, ancient hedges on either side of us, that sense of continuity. But then you look down at the bank, and there's violets and primroses. I mean, they're common plants, but don't they look beautiful? And how poor would the world be without those?
Absolutely.
And then we walked a little bit further, and there was a queen bumblebee searching for somewhere to make its nest. And you think about, what would the world be without bumblebees in it? And how I just love that sound, that buzzing sound in the early spring as the queen's looking for stuff, and knowing that if we didn't have pussy willow around, they'd have little to feed on. And then we went a bit further, didn't we? And the wind was blowing, and we got showered by blackthorn petals coming off, and that's just a magical moment.
That is it, absolutely. And it's just taking that moment to enjoy those small pleasures, but it is that connection that they give us to nature, and nature to us as part of nature, and pulls it all together.
Exactly.
Gives it all purpose.
Yes, exactly that.
Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I've loved it. Fantastic. Thank you very much. It's time for our reflective spot after what has been a beautiful day fueled by tea and cake. We knew there was rain in the forecast and the spots are just beginning to fall and the road is wet. So before we head home, let's think about our day. So what have been the highlights for you, Charlotte?
I've had a brilliant day. Such a lovely morning in the orchard with Mary and James. All that heritage and the stories connected to each variety of tree that we've seen. And I would have loved to have seen the Tamar Valley in its heyday when it was covered in blossom. It must have been so dreamlike. I also took away the importance of the sheer hard work that Mary and James have put in over the past few decades to conserve these rare local varieties of fruit trees that would otherwise have died out. And also, it's really made me want to try one of those bread fruit apples that tastes like strawberries.
I am in awe of the commitment and time they have put to the Tamar varieties. And I think for me, it was when James was speaking about his connections to nature, and just for both of them, the absolute joy, pleasure, comfort that nature brings them, both in very different ways, but just see how grounded and rooted to the earth they are. And for me, that just meant everything. A really, really special interview.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. And this afternoon with Rob down at South Hooe, again, another lovely interview. Hearing from Rob how you can age a hedge by looking at the number of different species you can see growing in a certain section of hedge. And I love that there was no such thing as a perfect hedge. You know, all sorts of different types for different areas will work. I also liked Rob's advice on if you're planting a hedge, plant it with a variety of plants that produce fruit and flower throughout the year, and that will really benefit biodiversity and nature. And my final takeaway from Rob was that we tend to like things neat and tidy, but wildlife likes it scruffy, and the scruffier the better. So I'll remember that when I want to tidy my garden, and I just think, no, I'll leave it.
No more hedge shame. You're allowed to let it breathe, let it go. Absolutely. Well, spending time with Rob actually was a more of a personal highlight. He is my hedge hero, and to spend the afternoon walking and chatting with such a knowledgeable, approachable gentleman has just been absolutely fantastic. And listening to his knowledge, his experience that he was just willing to share, and it was just a fantastic opportunity. From both interviews as well, though, and Rob clarified it on multiple occasions, is that we are constantly learning thoughts and ideas, processes on management, and what we're learning about the benefits. There's no right, there are some wrong ways, but we need to learn from our mistakes and keep moving forward. And from both interviews, it's about moving forward with hope and with optimism for people and for nature.
You've been listening to Nature Connects podcast from Tamar Valley National Landscape with Ginnette Sutherland and Charlotte Dancer. Our thanks to Mary, James and Rob for sharing their knowledge and experience as we celebrate the wonderful season of blossom and all things hedgerows, and also to Photo Now for their technical support. This podcast has been made possible thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund supported Tamara Landscape Partnership Scheme. Please like and share our podcasts and let us know which topics you'd like us to explore over the coming months.